Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. It's time once again for a zone discussion video, with us this time venturing into the frigid roof of the world, Northrend. And right off the bat, I have to say that this is probably my favorite overall continent, and I barely even played Wrath. Not only are the individual zones on average very good, but the zones do a fantastic job of feeling natural and blending together in usually very smooth ways. I also have to commend Blizzard for really committing to the bit of the cold north. Obviously there's more diversity than that statement implies, but with the exception of Sholazar Basin, every zone does feel like it fits into that vibe. Spots of genuine warmth feel quite rare, as they should, and I feel like most expansions nowadays are afraid to go that all in on a theme, prioritizing diversity and trying to avoid thematic burnout. But I appreciate that Wrath had such a unifying theme that we can associate with it and remember it by. The Dragon Isles, for example, by comparison, lacks any cohesive elements between its zones, and feels a bit theme parky as a result. But enough with glazing the continent as a whole. Let's start glazing specific zones. It only seems natural to start with what I consider the first zone. Now, technically, Northrend had two starter zones to choose between, Blizzard having learned from the Burning Crusade that funneling everyone into one spot right off the bat could be a risky affair. But come on, Howling Fjord was the one that took up 2/3 of the original trailer, and just fits the vibe better. And yeah, it's not like you can't see what I'm drawing already. The Fjord is my favorite zone of the continent, which is no small feat. The competition here is absolutely fierce, but this one just nails everything. Like I suggested earlier, it does feel cold, but outside of the actual snowy areas, it doesn't feel overly cold. Like you could walk around in a light jacket and be quite comfortable. It's got a very rustic feel to it with lots of dark green. The highlight is definitely the actual central fjord, Daggercap Bay, which puts both the centerpiece of Utgard Keep and the town of Valgard below it on full display, as well as the majestic cliff faces and the bay itself. And let's not forget the introduction that Alliance players get to the zone, sailing the narrow outlet and underneath a ship harpooned between the cliffs and set ablaze. Phenomenal. Horde players don't receive quite the Platinum tier entrance, but it's still quite strong. After a brief stint at Vengeance Landing, we get to ascend one of the many Vrykul elevator lifts spread around the edge of the zone. Ignoring the question of who is operating and maintaining these things, they manage to somehow not feel out of place. I guess it's the dragon heads carved into them that are reminiscent of the figureheads of a ship. Similar to these is the gondola that brings you from the mainland down to the Tuskar village of Kamagua. I love this thing. And yeah, I haven't even gotten to the whole southwestern portion of the zone, laden with islands and icebergs and beautiful sheets of ice. Seriously, this is some of the best looking ice in the game. Hey, there are pirates down there too. Did I mention the storm giants? They're not as effective as Fellreavers, but still. Would you believe I've only described about half of the zone so far? Yeah, there's also New Egamond and Westgard Keep, and that ravine with the dwarves who are going crazy from Yogg-Saron's whispers. And there's the Tonka and Iron Dwarves and a whole bunch of Vrykul settlements and the Ember Clutch with all of the burnt out trees, and yeah, there's a lot. One last bit I'll focus on is the music, which also manages to be my favorite of the continent, which is, again, no small feat. I adore this place, and it makes me want to go to Scandinavia. I assume they're exactly the same, storm giants and all. Jumping to the opposite end of Northrend, we have the other quote-unquote starter zone of Borean Tundra, which I recall had the moniker of Boring Tundra. Look, I don't expect it to top many people's lists, but it is still an absolute banger of a zone, and by no means boring. Especially if you're playing as Horde and literally ride the Zeppelin into Warsong Hold. Seriously. So look, this zone is gorgeous, but I have one major complaint about it. Borean Tundra, to me, feels like the textbook example of what I call a quilt zone. Well, patchwork zone probably sounds better. Whatever. Which is one that feels like a bunch of smaller zone ideas or tile sets sewn together. You've got the quarry bits and the surrounding red bits, you've got the yellow bits, you've got the geyser fields with the gnomes, you've got the green bits, you've got the glacial bits to the east, you've got the Riplash ruins to the south, and you've got the massive subzone of Koldara. and most of these individual areas look phenomenal in their own right. But when I try to think of a definitive image of the zone, I have no idea what to go with. What is Borean Tundra? And though there are the Amber Ledge quests leading up to it, Coldara in particular feels like it's only classified in this zone because it itself was too small to be its own zone. Like, you literally can't get there by foot, which isn't otherwise a thing until, like, Storm Peaks. I'd love if by the end of the questing you manage to rebuild the bridge that has been knocked out. Actually, here's an idea. Take the real estate used up by Wintergrasp, add it to this zone, and split it into 2 zones. One that focuses on the blue dragons and the Naga, one that focuses on the more lush parts. I don't know, maybe that helped give us 2 better defined zones, but I haven't thought it out that much. Still, there's a lot to love here. Data was a fantastic follow-up to the Nessingwary story, and I do tend to feel very cozy here. Most of the individual quest chains are quite enjoyable, though I think there were over 150 of them, which was probably a bit much. This is absolutely the Northrend zone I am most conflicted on. It'd probably be in my top half if I were to do actual rankings, but it's just so all over the place. I can't take it anymore. Let's move on. Dragonblight is necessary? Look, they couldn't do an Arctic continent and not have frozen wastes somewhere, but my goodness is this place dreary, which I think is part of the point. The lighting always feels dim, which may be to set the mood or to keep the white snow from hurting your eyes too much. Guess what? It doesn't work. My eyes still get tired of staring at this barren waste. Well, that's not fair. There are a bunch of dead trees to look at too. Wow, I'm sounding way more cynical than I expected. Look, snowy zones are a tough sell to me. I still think it's a strong zone even if it's in my lower half for the expansion. For me, the zone has always felt sort of divided into thirds. Coming from the west, we've got the heavily forested section, which includes some more blue dragonflight content, some Tonka stuff, the entrance to Ajol Narub, some Wolvar, and Egmar's Hammer. Coming from the east, we have Winterguard Keep, Naxxramas, and New Hearthglen, as well as the 2 Arthas-centric locations of the Forgotten Shore and Frostmourne Cavern. And lastly, we have the central region that focuses more on the dragons with Wyrmrest Temple, the 5 Dragon Shrines, the Path of the Titans, and Galakron's Rest, along with Milwaukee Harbor and the Wrathgate. But unlike Borean Tundra, all 3 of them manage to feel like a singular, albeit quite large, zone. Oddly enough, I feel like the Dragon Shrines are a bit of a weak point, as they feel like random splotches of environmental diversity for the sake of it. Like, if Dragonblight is supposed to be a dragon graveyard akin to the Kodo graveyard in Desolace, you could just have the middle section be one massive plain with dragon bones littered across. Wyrmrest Temple makes more sense as a United Nations type place, especially with it being built along the Path of the Titans, which was always fun to explore the path of, from the Shattered southern end all the way up to Ulduar. All in all, a very drab zone. Even the music is depressing. I don't like spending a lot of time here. But that doesn't make it a bad zone, and as I recall, it's one of the better ones for actual questing. Heck, it has the whole Wrathgate chain, which was both fun in its own right, and I believe the first in-game cutscene other than the starting zones. Pretty monumental. You're alright, Dragonblight.
Oh, Grizzlemai Hills! It's the best zone ever made in any video game ever! And that music though.
Okay, look, anyone who ever looked at anything WoW related online in the past decade or 2 knows the epic reputation this zone has, to the point that Grizzly Hills appreciation posts became comically predictable. I myself roll my eyes at them a bit, but also, like, it legitimately is an incredible zone that nails the vibes of a Canadian pine tree forest perfectly. And the music combines with that fantastically. You do have a snowy section coming down from the mountains of northern Howling Fjord, though that gets largely overshined. The centerpiece of the zone is the felled world tree of Andrasil, now called Grizzlemaw, which is occupied by the Redfang and Frostpaw clans of Furbolgs. Considering how incredible of a set piece this is, it really is criminal how underutilized it was. I can't believe we never got a dungeon inside of it or something. Also tying into the bears is Ursoc's Den on the northern edge of the zone. We've also got Thormodon, the collapsed Iron Dwarf city that, especially after interacting with them in Howling Fjord, was an eerie continuation of that thread before we eventually continue it in Storm Peaks. In the west, we've got Amberpine Lodge, which contained one of the best poop quests in the game, as you yourself have to practically destroy an outhouse retrieving the quest objective. Conquest Hold was pretty great too. If I recall, it had a miniature version of the Circle of Blood in it. On top of all that, there was also the whole Worgen storyline that culminated on Blood Moon Isle. And as part of that story, on the Alliance side, we visit the town of Silverbrook in what remains to this day one of my favorite quests in the game, as you come to the realization that the town is already taken over by Worgen, and you have to ride across the zone horseback with the lycanthropes in fervent pursuit. At the time, it was actually quite harrowing. Let's not forget the open world PvP subzone of Venture Bay, where Horde and Alliance would duke it out for yeah, nobody ever bothered with this objective. The rewards were trash, and there wasn't really anything funneling you here. Lastly, one of the coolest parts of the zone was the log flume you can ride from Blue Sky Logging Grounds down toward Venture Bay. I seriously love water parks, even if flumes get a bit too close to roller coaster territory for me. And this was one of the most genuine attempts to create such a sensation in the game. In sum, an absolute masterpiece of a zone that deserves a ton of praise. I just kind of wish it wasn't so universally praised as the best thing WoW has ever produced, because there's a lot more to the world to appreciate. Man, Zuldrak. I used to absolutely detest this zone, and it was easily my least favorite of Northrend. It was ugly, dark, and depressing. It made no sense to me that the zone felt like one massive structure with those gargantuan walls on the coastal side. It felt artificial to me that the zone was literally cut into 4 tiers. I was sick of killing trolls for the 3rd time in a row, and aside from Amphitheater of Anguish, questing here was just not fun. With the passage of time, however, I actually kind of like the place. Like, it's still one of the worst zones of Northrend, but that's not exactly an insult. I even came to find the zone, at least the western half of it, beautiful in its own right. Not so much the snowy sections. But it's still hard to enjoy at times. The Scourge presence adds to the bleakness, even if it is integral to the storyline of the Drukhari sacrificing their own Loa to survive. Which is an interesting story, but that's also more bleakness. This is a dying empire, and it shows. And seriously, Thrym is crazy the first time you see him, but he kind of takes away from the horror of Thaddeus himself. The Drakuru storyline was actually pretty engaging for the time, taking us through the pretty solid dungeon of Drak'Tharon Keep, and leaving us wanting to exact our revenge on him, which eventually we do. Although the Lich King showing up to kill him and spare us was kind of cheesy and dumb. Ultimately, this zone is never going to eclipse its truly great neighbors, but I do think I judged it too harshly in the past. It's not half bad. Sholazar Basin feels like Ungoro Crater, but done much, much better. I mean, the parallels aren't exactly subtle. These two zones, along with the Vale of Eternal Blossoms, were basically petri dishes for Freya. But whereas Ungoro feels undermined by the nearby presence of Feralis, Sholazar's most lively neighbor zone is Borean Tundra. Sholazar is also just straight up easier on the eyes. A vibrant jungle with cushy looking shores, particularly around River's Heart, the center of the zone that the numerous rivers all seem to flow into. We also have the return of our old buddy, Hemet Nessingwary, and his quests are still, for the most part, pretty close to their original concept. I'm of the staunch opinion that his batch of animal slaughtering quests should have carried forward into every expansion unchanged. You can do the extra stuff with him like Data, but leave the core hunting quests as they are. They're just straight up great. Additionally, a big portion of the zone's area and quests is devoted to the antagonistic factions of the Frenzy Heart Wolvar and the Oracle Gorlocks. Having us befriend both of them and then having to pick a side was downright cruel, but I'm grateful for it, as explained in my Covenants video way back. And of course, there are the 5 pillars integral to the vitality and protection of the zone. Having one of these as fallen and the surrounding lands as falling to Scourge influence was a great way of adding some diversity without completely undermining the zone's vibe. Oh, and did I mention the Waygate in the southern end of the zone that straight up teleports you to Ungoro? As far as jungle zones go, this is definitely one of my favorites. It's tempting to say it's just due to the juxtaposition with the rest of Northrend, but I think the zone itself just has gorgeous assets. And did I mention the serene music that plays here? Well, at least around River's Heart. I think the Ruby Dragon Shrine also has it. It's fantastic. Great zone. Oh man, the Storm Peaks. I've always loved this zone. It's one of those places of Azeroth that just exudes majesty. First of all, it gets the most important element right, in that the snowy mountains are downright gorgeous. Then it mixes in a sensational soundtrack, and it then makes everything feel all the more epic with the sheer scale of darn near everything here. I mean, it's not that big of a zone by modern standards, but it holds up. And back in the day, it felt massive. Even the landmarks themselves are huge. You've got all of the Titan edifices, including Thorm's Temple of Storms, the continuing Path of the Titans, the Engine of the Makers, and of course, Ulduar itself. And while we're talking about scale, we can't forget to mention the Frost Giants. They're home of Dun Niflheim and its gargantuan ice spikes and the haunting frozen figures of Thunderfall. But there's even more that the zone has to offer. There's the whole K3 section to the south, including the big old frozen waterfall. There's stuff with Frost Dwarves, Iron Dwarves, the Tonka, and the Valkyr. There's all the quests surrounding Loken, and of course the Frost Vrykul chain that takes you through Brunhildar village. After Howling Fjord, this is probably the best zone for Vrykul content. I know Icecrown has a fair amount, but those ones are more Scourge-aligned, often more Vargul focused. Heck, there's a fair amount of fun to be had just exploring the little holes of Titan architecture embedded into many of the mountains. I will say that my love for the zone has probably diminished slightly over the years. I'm not certain why, but I suspect it's because of the unknowable mystique of all the Titanic elements being somewhat diminished as we've gotten more of it over the years. I mean, we met all of them at the end of Legion after all. Still, a masterfully designed zone, and anytime you can get me to say that about a snow level is truly saying something. Were the competition less stacked, it easily could have been my favorite from Northrend. Moving on to the last major zone, we have Icecrown, and I'll be blunt here. In many ways, Icecrown kind of disappoints me, both the zone and the raid, for the very simple reason that it looks absolutely nothing like the image that Warcraft 3 left us off on. I was expecting an icy pillar surrounded by frosty waters and watery frost. And I know I shouldn't expect a one-to-one recreation of that, but it was such a stark contrast. I know, the pillar is still there in the raid, just surrounded and fortified with Saronite architecture. And I know the ground of much of Icecrown is supposed to just be the water frozen or something, but the vibe is completely different. But okay, let's try to put that aside for a second. Just because it's a new vision doesn't mean it's a bad vision. And Icecrown certainly has quite an identity. It's the very definition of foreboding, which I suppose is what you want out of the capstone zone of an expansion. The Scourge is pretty much everywhere. You've got the massive Saronite gates segmenting the main curve of the zone. You've got the imposing skybox. You've got the ominous music. You've got a bunch of quests that, at least as a fresh 80 back in the day, you basically had no hope of soloing. And at least in that last sense, this place felt more intimidating than even the Maw. I always appreciated being able to visit Sindragosa's Fall. It's the place from the cinematic, neato. Its placement obviously felt weird, but the Argent Tournament's presence did give us a bit of a sanctuary in this otherwise inhospitable environment. I always found Onslaught Harbor to be a bit of an oddity. Like, it's such a geographically useless place to set up a port. All of the nearby mainland is way up some steep cliffs. What was the Onslaught's game plan here? Are we just chalking that decision up to Dreadlord manipulation? I also have to mention the airships that act as mobile quest hubs. I guess these were kind of neat, but they honestly annoyed me more than anything because they weren't always visible on the map, and you could never just take a flight path to them and step away from your computer. Ultimately, it's a zone that I appreciate for knowing exactly what it is, but it's still not one I'm particularly excited to go to. Crystal Song Forest is a really cool zone that, despite being the central zone of the whole continent and having some cool lore, serves almost no gameplay purpose just because the massive latency hub of Dalaran was floating around on top of it. Yeah, it's pretty much the Dalaran intro quests, a few quests that send you back here at the start of Icecrown, and then a few from the Argent Tournament. And that is it. Originally, the tournament was going to be held here, which makes a ton of sense because why would you host it in one of the furthest reaches of the Lich King's home turf zone instead of in the mostly docile woodland near the magical floating city that can protect you? It has an interesting, albeit fairly unexplored backstory of highborn elves who came to live here who then got isolated after the Sundering. They and the Blue Dragons developed a contentious relationship, and in trying to fend off an attack from the dragons, accidentally crystallized about half of the zone, which I'm fine with because the crystal trees and environment are beautiful, though they can be a little harsh on the eyes if you stare at them for too long. That's only part of the zone though, as the rest remains a fairly untouched and sparse but tranquil forest. There's even a great tree here that should function the same as the 4 from Vanilla, but they never really did anything with it in-game. This is just a very zen zone, with 2 flavors of beautiful coexisting, and it's a bit of a shame that more wasn't done with it, as you tend to just fly over it and never really soak it all in. But as far as useless zones go, this has to be up there as one of my favorites. Winter Grasp, the open world PvP zone that was so horribly difficult for Blizzard to get right that it underwent about 1 billion updates during Wrath alone. But it was a beloved experience by many. I myself never cared much about it, as PvP rarely excites me, but the access to the raid was pretty appealing. However, and I know it can be argued that it's unfair not to do so, but I'm going to try to avoid letting the PvP elements factor in too heavily here, because the open world zone isn't really used for that anymore. I mean, maybe it is? I'm not sure. Not a lot of people are going out there at any rate. For those who do want to participate in the battle, it got turned into an epic battleground, which is probably what it should have always been. As a zone itself, it's not particularly interesting. Environmentally, it feels too similar to Dragonblight, with a larger emphasis on the Titan architecture. It's not terribly large, and of course there's not much to do here outside of the PvP and Vault of Archavon raid. And even if you do want to do something else, you're going to be flagged for PvP while there, so there's that persistent, albeit small sense of danger at all times. Additionally, it just serves as a bothersome no-fly zone somewhat near the middle of the continent that you need to be mindful of. Like I said earlier, in hindsight, this space could have been used for something else, but alas. Hrothgar's Landing is a zone that exists. The second patch zone added to the game, in fact. And frankly, it makes very little sense that it is its own zone. My theory is that they made it as part of the daily quest for the Argent tournament, and then realized that they couldn't fit it onto the existing Ice Crown map. So instead of redoing the Ice Crown map and probably having to update a bunch of coordinates behind the scenes, they probably found it easier to just make it its own zone. Because it really has no good reason to be one. Aside from being tiny and without any terribly interesting lore to it, the terrain just doesn't feel distinct from Ice Crown. And of course, there aren't even any quests native to the zone, just stuff sending you here from the tournament. Oh, and it has that fog filter around the edge of the screen. Really, the only thing cool about it is that it's the furthest north you can go on Azeroth, with the exception of the Lost Glacier that Death Knights visit exactly once in Legion. Despite this, it is completely undeserving of being a zone. But it is one, and I refuse to ignore it. And that's all of them. Talk about one heck of a lineup. Barring those last 1 or 2, even the bad zones are pretty dang excellent. The geography alone makes it easy to understand why it was such a beloved expansion. It honestly makes me kind of anxious for The Last Titan. I know they likely won't touch the original version of Northrend, but I always get apprehensive when Blizz decides to revisit old areas. Please don't ruin a good thing, or milk it to the point we don't appreciate it anymore. But we still know very little about it, so I'll try to remain optimistic. For this week's drawing, as I mentioned earlier, I drew Howling Fjord, and I had to go with a shot of Daggercap Bay that included Utgard Keep and Valgard below it, along with some beautiful cliff faces. Honestly, there were a ton of locations within the zone that I had to consider for drawing. It just didn't feel right not to go with one of the most central and most iconic ones. And I think it turned out alright. I especially like how the Aurora Borealis turned out. If anything, I believe it may have suffered a bit from me having to zoom out so far. It made it hard to include a lot of details, and thus it looks a little less refined than, say, my Eversong Woods drawing. But overall, I was still satisfied with how it turned out. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next week. Bye-bye!